The lives of eminent inventors are eminently illustrative of the same quality of perseverance. George Stephenson, when addressing young men, was accustomed to sum up his best advice to them, in the words, "Do as I have done, persevere." He had worked at the improvement of his locomotive for some 15 years before achieving his decisive victory at Rainhill. And Watt was engaged for some 30 years upon the condensing engine before he brought it to perfection. But there are equally striking illustrations of perseverance to be found in every other branch of science, art, and industry. Perhaps one of the most interesting is that connected with the disentombment of the Nineveh marbles, and the discovery of the long-lost cuneiform or arrow-headed character in which the inscriptions on them are written, a kind of writing which had been lost to the world since the period of the Macedonian conquest of Persia. An intelligent cadet of the East India Company, stationed at Kermanshah, in Persia, had observed the curious cuneiform inscriptions on the old monuments in the neighborhood, so old that all historical traces of them had been lost. And amongst the inscriptions which he copied was that on the celebrated rock of Behistun, a perpendicular rock rising abruptly some 1,700 feet from the plain, the lower part bearing inscriptions for the space of about 300 feet in 3 languages, Persian, Scythian, and Assyrian. Comparison of the known with the unknown, of the language which survived with the language that had been lost, enabled this cadet to acquire some knowledge of the cuneiform character, and even to form an alphabet. Mr. afterwards Sir Henry Rawlinson sent his tracings home for examination. No professors in colleges as yet knew anything of the cuneiform character. But there was a ci devant clerk of the East India House, a modest unknown man of the name of Norris, who had made this little understood subject his study, to whom the tracings were submitted. And so accurate was his knowledge, that, though he had never seen the Behistun rock, he pronounced that the cadet had not copied the puzzling inscription with proper exactness. Rawlinson, who was still in the neighborhood of the rock, compared his copy with the original, and found that Norris was right. And by further comparison and careful study the knowledge of the cuneiform writing was thus greatly advanced. But to make the learning of these 2 self-taught men of avail, a third laborer was necessary in order to supply them with material for the exercise of their skill. Such a laborer presented himself in the person of Austin Layard, originally an articled clerk in the office of a London solicitor. One would scarcely have expected to find in these 3 men, a cadet, an India House clerk, and a lawyer's clerk, the discoverers of a forgotten language, and of the buried history of Babylon. Yet it was so. Layard was a youth of only 22, traveling in the East, when he was possessed with a desire to penetrate the regions beyond the Euphrates. Accompanied by a single companion, trusting to his arms for protection, and, what was better, to his cheerfulness, politeness, and chivalrous bearing, he passed safely amidst tribes at deadly war with each other. And, after the lapse of many years, with comparatively slender means at his command, but aided by application and perseverance, resolute will and purpose, and almost sublime patience, borne up throughout by his passionate enthusiasm for discovery and research, he succeeded in laying bare and digging up an amount of historical treasures, the like of which has probably never before been collected by the industry of any one man. Not less than 2 miles of bas-reliefs were thus brought to light by Mr. Layard. The selection of these valuable antiquities, now placed in the British Museum, was found so curiously corroborative of the scriptural records of events which occurred some 3,000 years ago, that they burst upon the world almost like a new revelation. And the story of the disentombment of these remarkable works, as told by Mr. Layard himself in his Monuments of Nineveh, will always be regarded as one of the most charming and unaffected records which we possess of individual enterprise, industry, and energy. The career of the Comte de Buffon presents another remarkable illustration of the power of patient industry as well as of his own saying, that genius is patience. Notwithstanding the great results achieved by him in natural history, Buffon, when a youth, was regarded as of mediocre talents. His mind was slow in forming itself, and slow in reproducing what it had acquired. He was also constitutionally indolent, and being born to good estate, it might be supposed that he would indulge his liking for ease and luxury. Instead of which, he early formed the resolution of denying himself pleasure, and devoting himself to study and self-culture. Regarding time as a treasure that was limited, and finding that he was losing many hours by lying abed in the mornings, he determined to break himself of the habit. He struggled hard against it for some time, but failed in being able to rise at the hour he had fixed. He then called his servant, Joseph, to his help, and promised him the reward of a crown every time that he succeeded in getting him up before 6. At first, when called, Buffon declined to rise, pleaded that he was ill, or pretended anger at being disturbed. And on the count at length getting up, Joseph found that he had earned nothing but reproaches for having permitted his master to lie abed contrary to his express orders. At length the valet determined to earn his crown. And again he forced Buffon to rise, notwithstanding his entreaties, expostulations, and threats of immediate discharge from his service. One morning Buffon was unusually obstinate, and Joseph found it necessary to resort to the extreme measure of dashing a basin of ice-cold water under the bedclothes, the effect of which was instantaneous. By the persistent use of such means, Buffon at length conquered his habit, and he was accustomed to say that he owed to Joseph 3 or 4 volumes of his natural history. For 40 years of his life, Buffon worked every morning at his desk from 9 till 2. And again in the evening from 5 till 9. His diligence was so continuous and so regular that it became habitual. His biographer has said of him, work was his necessity. His studies were the charm of his life. And towards the last term of his glorious career he frequently said that he still hoped to be able to consecrate to them a few more years. He was a most conscientious worker, always studying to give the reader his best thoughts, expressed in the very best manner. He was never wearied with touching and retouching his compositions, so that his style may be pronounced almost perfect. He wrote the Epoques de la Nature not fewer than 11 times before he was satisfied with it. Although he had thought over the work about 50 years. He was a thorough man of business, most orderly in everything, and he was accustomed to say that genius without order lost 3/4 of its power. His great success as a writer was the result mainly of his painstaking labor and diligent application. Buffon, observed Madame Necker, strongly persuaded that genius is the result of a profound attention directed to a particular subject, said that he was thoroughly wearied out when composing his first writings, but compelled himself to return to them and go over them carefully again, even when he thought he had already brought them to a certain degree of perfection, and that at length he found pleasure instead of weariness in this long and elaborate correction. It ought also to be added that Buffon wrote and published all his great works while afflicted by one of the most painful diseases to which the human frame is subject. Literary life offers abundant illustrations of the same power of perseverance. And perhaps no career is more instructive, viewed in this light, than that of Sir Walter Scott. His admirable working qualities were trained in a lawyer's office, where he pursued for many years a sort of drudgery scarcely above that of a copying clerk. His daily dull routine made his evenings, which were his own, all the more sweet, and he generally devoted them to reading and study. He himself attributed to his prosaic office discipline that habit of steady, sober diligence, in which mere literary men are so often found wanting. As a copying clerk he was allowed third for every page containing a certain number of words, and he sometimes, by extra work, was able to copy as many as 120 pages in 24 hours, thus earning some 30s, out of which he would occasionally purchase an odd volume, otherwise beyond his means.